Today on America's Test Kitchen.
Julia makes easy sandwich bread. Lisa reviews electric food crispers. Jack has Chris tasting artisanal cream cheese. And Becky prepares zucchini bread. Right here on America's Test Kitchen.
Back in the 60s when I wanted to meditate, I would just stand there and go, Namyo Renge Kyo. You probably remember that. These days when I want to meditate, all I do is take a nice yeast bread, a sandwich bread, and I knead it for about 10 or 15 minutes, and that really calms me down. But I know that a lot of you don't want to take the time and effort it takes to make a yeast bread, so we looked into some alternatives, and one of them was the no-knead bread we did a few years ago. You let the bread sit, it had a lot of water in the dough overnight, and that actually developed structure and gluten, so you didn't have to knead it, but that took a lot of time. So now we're going to go back and figure out a better way to do this, and we found a recipe from the early 1900s called batter bread. It's a very wet bread. You can almost beat it up like you would any other batter, and it takes much less time, but it gives you great structure. So let's go into the test kitchen with Julia and figure out how to make an easy sandwich bread in about half the time. So before we get started on our easy sandwich bread recipe, here's a letter that I think is odd, to say the least.
Okay.
I love this. My mother loves homemade bread but does not make it. Okay, fine. The idea of yeast being a living organism freaks her out, and she's certain she can feel the yeast crawling on her hands. I've heard a lot of reasons not to make yeast bread, but
that's a good one.
That's really.
So you have to make it for me.
She doesn't believe this. This is just, it freaks me out, right? So anyway.
That's awesome.
Anyway.
Well, in talking about yeast, that is a crucial ingredient, especially if you're making bread. But if you're making a quick sandwich bread, the bread is going to take about half the time as it usually takes to make a traditional sandwich loaf. And the reason it's so speedy is because we're going to use a lot of yeast. And the other thing we're going to do is use a lot of water and turn the dough into more of a batter. And that eliminates a lot of the kneading time and the shaping time, so it's a much faster loaf. The few recipes that are out there for batter breads kind of look like this. They're squat, they have a really ugly bumpy top, and you can see there's that dense line on the bottom of where it's really wet, and the crumb texture, it just crumbles right apart. It doesn't have much structure. And worst of all, the smell, it just tastes like raw yeast. It doesn't have any flavor of the bread.
So it should be called just bad batter bread.
Exactly.
BBB.
That's right. So we have some problems to fix. And the first solution is the type of flour you use. So this is 2 cups of bread flour. And then into this, we're going to mix a little bit of wheat flour. And this will solve some of the flavor problems, because wheat flour obviously has a wheaty, deeper flavor. And this is 6 tablespoons of wheat flour. And we're going to add a lot of yeast. Now, usually for a bread this size, you'd use about a teaspoon of instant yeast. We're going to go all the way up to 2 1/4 teaspoons of instant yeast.
Like a full pack worth.
That's right. And again, you want to use instant yeast because you can add it right to the dry ingredients. You don't have to bloom it ahead of time, and that saves you time. So we're going to mix that together. And now we're going to add a little bit of butter. This is 2 tablespoons of melted butter, and that helps with the flavor. And a little bit of honey. Now this is a teaspoon of honey, and then I'll, of course, give the bread some sweetness, but it also will help the bread brown in the oven. And now we're going to add water. We're going to add a lot of water. This is 1 1/4 cups. And we want this water to be really warm to really jumpstart that yeast. So we're looking for a temperature of about 120 degrees. We're going to add right to the bowl. And now we're going to use a mixer, which is not unusual, but notice I'm using the paddle, not the dough hook. And that's because this dough is going to be so wet that the paddle will do a better job of mixing it together. All right, so we're going to mix this on low for a minute till it's nice and combined. Then I'm going to increase it to medium and let it go for 4 minutes, but halfway through I'll scrape down the bowl. All right, so it's been kneading like that for 4 minutes. And again, halfway through, I went and I scraped down the sides of the bowl with a greased spatula because this dough is very sticky. All right, so now is the first of 2 very short rises. They're only 20 minutes. And usually at this point, a bread would take at least an hour for this first rise, but we used a lot of yeast. And we used that hot water that really got the yeast going. So it'll scrape down the sides of the bowl. Make sure there's no big stuck bits of dough on the side of the bowl because those will dry out. And then we're going to cover the bowl with plastic wrap and let her sit at room temperature for, again, about 20 minutes.
Okay.
Crispy foods like potato chips, crackers, and cereal can sog out pretty fast once the package is open, especially in humid weather. And that's where the Brisker Elite comes in. This is an electric box, and it promises to keep foods crisp and fresh. It uses an electric heater to keep the inside dry at a temperature in the high 90s, so moisture stays out. Now, we compared 2 sets of open bags of snacks. We put one set on the counter, sealed with clips, and the other we left open in the brisker, which is how they ask you to do it. Now, even though the humidity wasn't very high in the test kitchen, it only took a few days for popcorn to turn soggy. In the brisker, it stayed crunchy for more than a week. Graham crackers, cereal, potato chips, and cookies on the counter sogged out in 7 days, but they stayed crispy and fresh tasting for more than 3 times that long in the brisker. Pretzels were the only food that really didn't do better in the brisker. They dried out and they got brittle after 9 days. Now, the brisker costs $149. That's pricey, but it's worth it if you live in a humid climate. In fact, when we measured the brisker's energy use, we found it uses only half the electricity of an average light bulb. So it's not going to run up your electric bill, and you'll save money when you don't have to throw out wasted food.
Okay, so our dough has been rising for 20 minutes, and you can see it looks quite a bit different already. That yeast has really gotten going. And if you remember, I didn't put any salt in the dough, and that wasn't an accident, that was on purpose, because when you add salt to a dough, it prevents gluten development. And when you're dealing with a batter bread, you really want to build as much gluten as you can. So when you delay adding the salt, it's a good thing for the gluten. This is 3/4 teaspoon of table salt. Dissolve it in 2 tablespoons of water. So now we're going to add this salt water to the dough, and we're going to put it back on the mixer for just 40 seconds.
Now that would be a huge no-no with a regular yeast bread, because you'd be beating it after the first rise.
That's right.
Which would be, you want to just barely deflate it, right?
That's right, yeah. Usually at that point you'd be churning it or handling it very gently. But here, again, this dough is so wet, it's a different ballgame. So I'm going to give this about 40 seconds on low to let that water incorporate into the dough, and then I'm going to crank the speed to medium and let it go for another minute. All right, so it's been a minute, and you can see this dough has been well mixed. And now it's time, believe it or not, to put it into the loaf pan. And again, because this batter is so wet and so sticky, there's no shaping. So I'm using a greased spatula, because that really helps when you're dealing with sticky doughs. Let's get the dough off this paddle. And I'll scrape it down into the bowl, into one nice big clump.
So is this really going to turn out like bread?
You tell me.
I will tell you. I mean, it just seems everything is a bit odd.
Everything's a bit unusual, isn't it? Yeah. Well, again, when you speed up the timetable on a yeast bread, everything is a little different. So now, using this greased spatula, I'm going to even out the dough in the loaf pan, just pushing it into the corners a little bit more. It'll migrate there eventually, but it's nice to give it a little bit of a head start. And we're going to cover it with plastic. And we're going to let this bread sit with the cover on for 10 to 15 minutes, then take the cover off and let it go another 5 to 10 minutes before it's ready for the oven. And I'll show you the reason why we do it with the cover on and the cover off. Because you can see this has been sitting for about 30 minutes with the cover on. If you let the dough rise into the plastic wrap, it really wrecks the top of the dough, and you can see it starting to sink where that divot is. It's not good.
You know, one of the obvious tricks to make this go faster was to use twice as much yeast, but the real secret lies in the amount of water in the dough. There's a formula called hydration level. It means the weight of the water versus the weight of the flour. This kind of loaf, it's about 70%. We were up to almost 90%, about 87%. That's a lot of extra water. And the question is, why does that help? Well, there are 2 proteins in flour, glutenin and gliadin, but they need to get together to form gluten, which creates the structure in the bread. Water is really the thing that does the trick. It lets them move around, find each other, and create structure. More water, the quicker that happens. The second thing that happens is that we ended up with a batter, not a dough, so we could use the paddle in the mixer and really beat it up very quickly to create structure in 1/3 of the time. The last thing is there's a lot of water in the dough, so when it goes in the oven, a lot of steam gets generated, which means you don't have to let the yeast do all the work. The water comes in and helps out. So for really quick bread and a very good bread, just increase the water level as we've done here.
All right, so our loaf, again, it rose for about 10 to 15 minutes with the plastic on, but then we took the plastic off, let it go another 5 to 10 minutes, and now it's ready for the oven. We're going to give it a quick egg wash glaze. That'll make the top nice and shiny. And this is just 1 egg that's lightly beaten, but it's beaten with a little bit of water. That helps make it a little easier to brush over the top, and a little bit of salt. All right, so she is ready for the oven, and it's a 375-degree oven for about 40 to 45 minutes. All right, so this bread has been in the oven for about 45 minutes, and now it's time to take its temperature. And we're looking for 208 to 210 on the dot. Doesn't that look good?
Looks great.
All right, so we're gonna take it right out of the loaf pan. And to do that, just make sure you have some clean kitchen towels. Slide it right out.
Smells good too.
Oh, doesn't that smell good?
Mm.
So for a little extra flavor and to soften the crust up a bit, we're gonna brush it with just a little bit more melted butter. This is a tablespoon. And of course, we're gonna brush it on the top, but also on the sides. All right, oh, that smells good, the hot bread, the hot butter. But we gotta let it cool completely before we can slice her open. All right, so the loaf is nice and cool and ready for tasting. Now I'm gonna go right into the center.
First thing we should notice is the texture looks great.
That's right.
Right. And
Yeah,
the crust is great too.
Yeah, you remember that other loaf, it was all crumbly in the center. This has some nice chew.
That has really good flavor. I like the wheat flour in it,
Yes,
which is
the
really
wheat
nice.
flour is nice. And a little bit of honey,
This would also make great toast.
it would.
We tested quite a few of the early batter bread recipes from the early 1900s, and they were almost inedible. It was a good concept, but they were really terrible. This is great. So the secret to a really good, quick and easy sandwich bread started with doubling the yeast, having a little bit of honey in there, whole wheat flour. The big secret was adding a lot of extra water, which turned it into a batter instead of a dough. When you put it in the oven, that extra water actually turned to steam and provided extra lift. So from America's Test Kitchen to your kitchen, a whole new bread recipe called Easy Sandwich Bread. Have you noticed that everything in this world is becoming artisanal? Sometimes I think I have artisanal kids. I know you do. But when it comes to things like cream cheese, there's always been one brand for like 50 years, and now you actually have choices. The question is, are those choices, which are probably more expensive, any good?
Yes, they're definitely more expensive, and we're going to find out if they're any good. We did a number of taste tests. We did it the way you're doing here, straightforward. First thing we noticed is huge flavor differences. Philadelphia, the brand that we've all used, is pretty one-dimensional. There's a little bit of salt and there's a little bit of dairy. Some of these artisanal brands, lavender, radishes, herbs, flowers. There's small batches of milk. They're handling that milk in such a way to try to preserve some of those unique flavors. So big flavor differences, really big textural differences. And textures really range quite considerably. This one here is what I would call smooth and tacky. This one here is light and fluffy. Some people compared it to whipped cream. I think actually it's probably closer to ricotta cheese. Some of the others were quite dry and crumbly, like goat cheese. And so the textures were really quite different, the flavors were different. We had very strong preferences in this taste test and when we put them on bagels, and really felt like if you wanted to upgrade your morning bagel, spending extra money on an artisanal cream cheese is a good investment. Then we did some baking tests. They don't work so well in recipes that were designed for Philadelphia cream cheese. So I've been talking, you've been eating delicious cream cheese. Anything you're noticing about the samples?
Well, have you thrown in Philadelphia in here for me?
Maybe.
See, you know, here's the deal. If I ask Jack for a lifeline and I'm drowning, I get like a bag of cement. I go right down to the bottom, you know what I mean? Well, I don't, this feels like Philadelphia cream cheese to me, which it's what I grew up with. This is the fluffy, creamy, watery, slightly grainy thing. It's got good flavor, but I mean, it's just different. And then this one's a drier,